episode 2 in the series about writing your rebuttal speech. In this episode, we're going to talk about what an argument is. You need to understand an argument is a structure. It's not something that you say. It has multiple parts. Because if you don't know what an argument is, you don't know how to take an argument apart. And remember, in this speech, we're not making arguments necessarily. We are taking apart the arguments of others. So, what's an argument? An argument is essentially a collection of claims. All right? So at a basic level, an argument, so you can have like a specific argument. For example, veganism lowers cholesterol is an argument, a specific argument, right? It's like a specific piece of the puzzle. But if I say you should all be vegan, that's a much broader argument, which is the collection of a series of smaller arguments. So when people say an argument, they can either mean one specific argument or they can mean like a big, gigantic argument. So the United States is the land of freedom is a huge argument, right? The United States has more public education systems than other countries is a much smaller argument that's related to the big argument. So when you're looking for an argument, you're looking for a general sort of big argument, but you also want to look for specific places where the argument has actually been made so you can read about what other people are saying. And then what's going to happen is you're going to come up with a bunch of claims that all lead to the argument that you're interested in rebutting. The difference between a claim and an evidence is that a claim is essentially debatable. It has to be proven to be true, right? You are claiming that it is true. The evidence is the stuff that you use to prove that the claim is true. Evidence is also debatable. So if you say a study by Harvard found that 63% of women reported having been sexually harassed in college classrooms, you can debate that study, right? How was it designed? What were the questions they were asked? How was the sample size? You can debate the study, but the study is at least has some observable data, as opposed to the claim that colleges are unsafe for women is way bigger, all right? So yes, I know you can debate evidence, but evidence is going to be less debatable than the claim. So there are some examples. Spinach is better than chocolate is a claim. So evidence, 1 cup of spinach only has 7 calories, while 1 ounce of John chocolate has 150 calories. So notice we're looking at numbers, we're looking at proper nouns, right? That's how we kind of know we're in evidence territory, because there's actual evidence provided, whereas this is just an assertion that it's true. Chocolate has caffeine, but spinach does not. So again, we could debate whether or not caffeine is good for you. Obviously, that's part of the issue. But the evidence is true. Chocolate does have caffeine and spinach does not. It's not really debatable. It's evidence. 1 cup of spinach has 0.1 gram of fat, while dark chocolate has 9 grams of fat, okay? And then, of course, if you get different evidence, you can flip the claim. You could argue that dark chocolate is better than you for spinach, and then you would have to provide evidence for what dark chocolate has is spinach, right? So, for example, both spinach and dark chocolate have iron. People are more likely to eat dark chocolate because it's a candy. So chocolate is better for you because if we tell people to eat chocolate, they'll at least get their iron. But if we tell them to eat spinach, they won't. So you can find different evidence to prove different claims true. That's why in rhetoric, we're never dealing with truth. We're just dealing with who has the better argument, because there's no way to prove what's better, spinach or chocolate. We can debate it, though. In geography, a place may change over time. So, for example, a glacier caused the formation of Yosemite Valley, the Grand Canyon. So these are all just statements of evidence, right? They're relatively true. Most people aren't going to debate you on them, but they will debate you on the claims. And your claim is only as good for you as your quality of evidence. For us, evidence are the same as our support. So if we look over here in our outline, remember the supports? So over here, they're using a lot of what I would call statistics, a lot of numbers, right? 7 calories, 150 calories, that's a statistic. Grams of fat is a statistic, all right? These are all occurrences. A glacier at Yosemite is an occurrence. The Grand Canyon is an occurrence. Boston is an occurrence. We don't want to just list one kind of support. So yes, statistics are great. Yes, occurrences are great. But we also have stories. We also have analogies. We also have testimony. These are all different kinds of evidence that we can use to support our claims. But you really have to understand the difference between a claim and evidence. And you're going to have small claims, right? So for your main points, every main point is going to be a sort of minor claim. But then you're going to have one big, gigantic claim, which is going to be called your thesis statement. So that's the basic structure of an argument, claim and evidence. All right, so the first thing you have to decide for the speech is like, what claim are you going to be rebutting? And you can pick anything that you want. I'm going to continue with my veganism example. So I'm going to go to The Economist, which is a pretty reasonable moderate, and I'm going to say arguments in favor of veganism. Because again, I want to read from reasonable sources. So I don't want to go to some whack job site and read about why they support veganism. I want to read actual arguments. And here's a YouTube video, How Could Veganism Change the World, from The Economist. So I could do a video if you want to do videos. I do not love videos. Okay, so here's an argument from 2019. We like recent arguments. How much would giving up meat help the environment? And it's nice when they write them as questions, I think, because that indicates they maybe actually are going to weigh some arguments instead of just telling you what's true. So going vegan for 2/3 of meals could cut food-related carbon emissions by 60%. All right, so the big argument that we're looking at is whether or not people should become vegan. That's the big, gigantic argument. But then you need to be more specific because that's really broad. So in this case, The Economist is talking specifically about environmental issues. That helps narrow down your scope. If you want to do health issues, if you want to do like economics, like maybe you don't think that like only rich people can be vegan kind of thing, that's fine. I'm just going to go with environment. That people should become vegan as a means of helping the environment, right? Right, which also means in reverse that I am making the argument that veganism doesn't help the environment as much as people say it does. Right? So that's sort of the positive argument I am asserting. But again, it's really easy to just find some facts that like veganism doesn't help the environment and just stick them in a speech. So we're not doing that. We're going to do a rebuttal of the opposing argument. So while this is implied in the speech, it's not my primary claim. My primary claim is that their claims are weak. So I rebut the argument that people should become vegan as a means of helping the environment. That's the claim. Now I need to find, so if people should become vegan, right, if this is the big claim that I'm rebutting, now, what'd I do? Now I need to find, get out of here. Now I need to find the smaller claims, right, the specific claims that people are actually using to hold up that argument. So if we go to The Economist, they're saying, guzzling steaks and chops incur high costs for carnivorous humans and the planet. Over half of adults in America and Britain say they want to reduce their meat consumption, according to a market research firm. So this is evidence, it's testimony, and a statistic. The amount of meat that Americans and Britons consume has risen by 10%. That's another statistic, according to the UN Food and Agriculture, etc. So here's a study that got published by Oxford University. That's a study. I count that as statistics, but they're not the same, but they're close enough. Yada yada. So what we're looking for is the kind of claims that this person makes. I'm seeing a lot of evidence that's good, but the big claim essentially is that going vegan helps food-related carbon emissions. So right, carbon emissions are a kind of environmental help. So that's a factual claim. We'll get into that later. So that might be one of the claims that I look for to argue it, right? So first, I rebut the claim that veganism will decrease food-related carbon emissions. That's a claim. So you're looking for a bunch of claims. So for now, don't worry about putting them in the actual outline. We're going to learn about that in a minute. But you have to start to look for, first of all, what's your big claim going to be? So what do you want to rebut? What's the big argument that you want to rebut? Here are some examples, right? That Trump should be elected. So here's some, I'll write them as questions instead of, right? Should Trump be elected for a second term? And usually I look for should words, right? So people should do something. This should happen. Somebody should do that. Somebody should, students should go to college, right, after high school. I don't know, whatever you want. I don't know who you are, but I just like pick, you need to think about things you actually give a shit about, okay? I can give you these all day long, but you need to pick the argument. And then you got to start reading sources. So you got to read 3, 4, 5 sources minimum and see what kinds of claims people are making to support their position that people should go vegan. And you cannot look at whack job sources. You have to look at sources that seem reasonably credible. That's why I gave you that chart that we talked about in video 1. So then just start listing them out. Get a piece of paper out, get a document, and just start listing out what claims are they making, what evidence are they using. What claims are they making, what evidence are they using. So this particular article from The Economist is making the specific claim that veganism cuts food-related carbon emissions by 60%. Okay, what's the evidence that they're using? Pick the 2 or 3 strongest pieces of evidence, great. And then go ahead and look for another article. So I already chose The Economist. I don't want to necessarily go to The Economist again, but I could go to, like that documentary I was talking about, documentary, Game Changers, People Should Eat Vegan. And then remember, we're focusing on the environment now rather than everything about veganism, which would be way too broad in scope. So, so this is called treehugger.com. So I'm assuming these are people in favor of veganism. And I'm gonna Google like environment and see what I get. Nothing. So this is about health, and that's fine if that's what your speech is about, but you have to narrow the scope of the speech. So, so I'd scroll through here until I found somebody who makes an argument about climate change. So like this is Telegraph. This is a pretty reasonable resource. It's from the United Kingdom, but it's sort of like the equivalent to our like Huffington Post maybe. So this is about health. I don't want to, oh, do I have to subscribe? Oh, this always happens. Well, you got to just kind of skip these. You can also go into your Milne Library account and you can actually look up these articles for free in Milne Library. But again, I'm going to look for the claim they're making about vegan diet and the environment, and then I'm the way that they do about things and what evidence they're using to support themselves. So now that's basic claim versus evidence. So that's the first thing you have to understand is you have to find the claims, you have to find the evidence. You got to find a lot of it. But there's a missing piece here. It's not just claim and evidence. Because as we talked about, right, I can make the claim that spinach is better for you than chocolate. Okay? And I can say that 1 cup of spinach has 7 calories while an ounce of dark chocolate has 150. All right? Or even better, I think that 1 cup of spinach has 0.1 grams of fat while one has this many grams of fat. Or spinach has has caffeine, but spinach does not. Whichever one of these you want to pick. But I think this one's a really good example because it's like, okay, your claim is spinach is better for you than chocolate. And that claim is debatable because I could say chocolate is better for you than spinach. And then I say, well, one fact I have, right, one piece of evidence I have is that chocolate contains caffeine. What makes chocolate having caffeine worse for you, right? Why is it that spinach being caffeine free makes it better for you? That is called the warrant. So now we get into kind of the really complex part of an argument. We've talked about the claim, which is the thing that you're arguing is true. And we've talked about the support or evidence, which is the supports, right? The stories, the analogies, the statistics, the studies that you're using to say why your claim is true. But then there's this thing called a warrant. The warrant is the thing that makes the support prove the claim. So in this example, the claim is that universities should reinstate affirmative action. Affirmative action is, in this case, would be letting students into college based on different quotas for marginalized populations. So for example, the United States, has severely marginalized students of color, Black students, Latinx students. They have across the board less access to higher education. So the idea is that, SUNY Geneseo would have to set aside 20% of its admissions process to let in students of color. And currently they only let in 9%, right? And the idea is that students of color are already disadvantaged. So the reason they're not getting in isn't because they're not smart. It's because systems sort of work against them. And the evidence, so this is not great evidence. So the evidence would need to be like an actual piece of evidence. Affirmative action provides equal access to education for all ethnic groups is a definition, which is kind of evidence. It could be better. But let's suppose we find a study, for example, that affirmative action has led to a certain number of increase in the well-being of Black communities with higher rates of education, all right? There's still this question of why is it that a fact that affirmative action has led to a positive outcome means that universities should then do that thing. And the warrant in this case is that, like, we want equal access to college. But that warrant is debatable because I could say, well, yeah, I mean, sure, if you let more people of color into college through affirmative action, of course, you're going to get improved rates of, like, health and well-being and wealth in those communities. But I think people should get into college based on grades, because college is about letting the best of the best do well. College is not about like settling all of the scores of American history. So the warrant is debatable. And really good arguers, like childhood level arguing, right? Kindergarten arguing is find a claim, give some evidence, call it an argument. But the really top-notch arguers find a warrant and they deconstruct the warrant. So you can do that in two ways. One way is you can be like, okay, suppose your warrant is true, right? And the other way is you can just argue against the warrant. So before we get into those, which are strategies of argument, let me make sure we understand this, right? The Toulmin model. 3 parts to an argument. There's the claim, right, which is explained up here. We already talked about this. This is the main point, the thesis, the idea. It may be directly stated. It can be implied. We don't want it to be implied. You have to prove it, right? The support are the reasons given in support of the claim. They're evidence, proof, data, grounds, whatever you want to call them, right? But they usually are facts, statistics, expert opinions, examples, explanations, logical reasoning. So we call these supports, S-U-P-P-O-R-T-S, supports. Then there's this thing called the warrant. The warrant is an assumption underlying the argument. They are generally accepted beliefs and values. They are common ways our culture or society views things because they are so commonplace. Warrants are almost always unstated. So rarely will you find warrants stated in things that you read. You might if you're lucky, but you have to find the warrants. So as you're reading through, to go back to our previous form, as you're reading through the arguments people are making about veganism, so claim veganism reduces carbon emissions, right? Claim veganism frees up more land area for grazing cattle, whatever you want to do, right? You have to find the evidence, but then the other thing you have to find is the warrant. So in this case, spinach is better for you than chocolate is the claim. Chocolate has caffeine in it is the evidence. The warrant is that caffeine is bad for you. And that's why. And so I'm not going to sit here and debate whether or not chocolate has caffeine in it. I'm just going to be like, yeah, but what's your evidence that caffeine's bad for you? Because I can probably find evidence that caffeine is perfectly healthy and fine. All right, so you got to think about the warrants as well. So when you're thinking about your opposition, you got to find their claims, you got to find your evidence, and you got to find their warrant. So you have to basically find this particular layout. Now, there are other parts of the Toulmin model. There are qualifiers, there's backing, there's the rebuttal. This is the part we're working on. So we're doing a rebuttal as kind of already part of the whole deal. But I wouldn't worry so much about these, although they are interesting, and you're welcome to look at them if you want. But the most important thing is you have to understand that every argument has a claim, has a data or evidence, and it has a warrant. And you have to be able to identify those things. So that's your first job, is you got to start reading about the argument that you want to rebut. You got to read a bunch of articles. You got to watch videos. You got to watch documentaries. You got to read blog posts, whatever you want to do. And you got to write down all the different claims they're making, and you got to write down all the evidence they're using, and then all the warrants that connect the evidence to the data. And this is the really hard part, okay? But that is the basic argument. So we do this thing now. So once we identify it, so let's suppose for the Game Changers documentary, or for my argument, that I found this argument that I rebut the claim that veganism will decrease food-related carbon emissions. So that's one of them. I have to find the warrant. There's only one part of this speech where I actually have you deconstruct a warrant. So it is in the claim called, so for now, leave aside the fact claim, leave aside the stasis slip, and go down to where it says turning the tables, okay? Turning the tables is a specific strategy of argument where you find the person's warrant and you use it against them. Or if you can't figure out how to do that, you can at least just debate the warrant. I don't want you, in this particular main point, I don't want you debating the evidence, right? You can find evidence that shows that affirmative action does not give equal access to ethnic groups. It's not that hard to find competing evidence. You can Google a piece of evidence for every piece of evidence that you find. The hard part is identifying the warrant and then undermining it, okay? So the turning the tables is when you identify a warrant and use it against the opposition, or if you can't figure that out, then you at least just undermine the warrant. All right? So that's what turning the tables is. And there's a reading about turning the tables in your course pack if you want to, it's been assigned to you. Okay. So here's my argument. So supporters of veganism argue that veganism decreases food-related carbon emissions. So that's the argument that they're making. But, and then I'm going to obviously like contradict that. So my first pieces of supports in this case is going to be a testimony, right? So I'm going to choose a testimony. And the testimony is from The Economist. This is my evidence. So this is not a claim. I've already written the claim up here. So The Economist reports that, what did it say? That The Economist reports that it was some study. I'd have to find the study and fill this in. Has found that decreasing animal consumption reduces carbon emissions by 2/3. All right, so there's my fact. We can tell it's a statistic, right? We can tell it's done by some incredible study. We just need to explain. So you want to say who this is. I'm just going to say it's like Harvard University for now. And then what you would also do is you would want to put in a little footnote. You'll see this in the sample. So I just put in a little footnote, insert footnote. And I put the actual like link and citation, because if somebody asks you like, oh, where'd you get your evidence? You want to be able to tell them that. You don't just want to be like, oh, it was some article I read in The Economist. No, you have to have the evidence with you. So you're just going to tell the listener of the speech, hey, I found this in The Economist and the study's by Harvard University. And you could even say it's from 2019, because if it's a recent study, it's nice to let people know that. But if it's from like 2012, you might not want to mention that, because that's not like a, you know, more recent studies are typically better, but not always. And then I want to have where it is in my footnote. So that's how we do citations for a speech. All right. So you may want to add a detail, like maybe you want to detail the study, or maybe somebody else corroborated it. So maybe it's not just The Economist that said it, but maybe somebody else has said it as well, right? So you can do a lot with whatever detail, however you want to expand the argument. But then you want to turn the tables on it. So this is the supports, which is testimony. And then supports number 2 is a rebuttal or turning the tables that is supported by evidence. So what's the warrant here? This is what's really tricky. What's the warrant for this? So the claim is that veganism decreases food-related carbon emissions. The evidence is that a Harvard study showed that when people decrease animal consumption, they don't put as much carbon into the air. What's the warrant, right? What's the thing that connects this to the claim? Well, there's a couple of things. All right. So one, there's the logic of the study itself, right? So how does the study know? How did they figure this out? Did they survey 7 people? Because if so, it's like, I don't know about 7 people. Like, how did they measure carbon emissions? Here's the other problem. I don't know if food-related carbon emissions are a huge deal. How bad is food-related carbon emissions? Great. Going vegan decreases food-related carbon emissions, and there's evidence that that's the case. But, like, are carbon emissions bad? So I'm going to write food-related carbon emissions versus other kinds of carbon emissions. See what I get. Because I don't know. I'm just thinking through the warrants, right? The assumptions that they're making. Top 10 foods with the climate food. What's your diet's carbon? Eat your way to a smaller carbon footprint. Okay, here's one from National Geographic. To leave a smaller carbon footprint, choose chicken over beef. Choosing chicken over beef cuts our carbon emissions by a surprising amount. Food production accounts for food production accounts for about 1/4 of total carbon emissions. 1/4. That's it, 25%. So, this is awesome, right? So this is what? National Geographic, sweet. That's great. But even assuming that the 2/3 stat is true, right? Let's just assume that the stat is true. Food-related carbon emissions, according to National Geographic, account for only 1/4 of total carbon emissions. So, even if you go vegan, you're still not tackling the most problematic part of environmental crisis, right? Because the warrant this whole time is just assuming that food-related environmental impact is the most important thing. But, you know, great, go vegan, and yeah, you might reduce your food-related carbon emissions by 65% or 2/3 or whatever, but that's only a quarter of overall carbon emissions. So, like, it doesn't attack all the bad stuff that happens, for example, when you take a plane, right? And then, even more, the National Geographic also says that you can, every single time. Okay, but I remember what it said. So the National Geographic, and while I'm over here, I'm gonna grab that link too, so I keep it with me, because you don't want to lose your links, right? The National Geographic also says that just switching from beef to chicken will reduce carbon emissions. So you see what we've done here? We have found a basic argument about why you should not go vegan, and we have undermined the warrant that connects the evidence of carbon emissions from the study to the claim. And that is a turning the tables. That's precisely what we do. We instead of arguing against the study, instead of telling them like, no, it won't reduce your carbon emissions at all, we're just like, yeah, okay, let's assume that you're right. Like, the economist is right. The study is right. But even if the study is right, consider that food-related carbon emissions, this is also testimony and statistic, and then there's an even backup one from, and then you can add an analogy here if you want, because, you know, again, we don't just want to use statistics and facts and studies, because, like the Atlantic article said, that's not really the stuff that gets at people, right? Analogies and stories are part of the deal. So here's an analogy. So you can come up with an analogy where it's like, let's suppose you're like running out of money. And so someone tells you that if you reuse all of your plastic bags, you will save 10 cents on the dollar. So you're like washing all your plastic bags and you're reusing them instead of like buying new plastic bags every time you need them. But meanwhile, you're spending like $200 a month in a gym membership that you never used. Right? See? So the point is that you're focusing on the minor part of the problem. So why are we going to bother talking to people about veganism when if we could just get them to switch from beef to chicken, that would solve at least a little bit of the problem? And also that clearly food-related environmental change is not the bigger issue. So that is your turning the tables. So you want to go ahead and you want to start by writing that main point. And then if you come back in the next video, we will talk about the other two main points, which are both built on this, this other thing called stasis theory, which when we talk about claims, there are all these different types of claims, and it's helpful to know the types of claims because you don't just want to address factual claims. So these are all right here, this stuff we're doing, this is all factual claims, and we want to be able to address all different kinds of claims. So I would work on this one for now, and then when you're ready, come back and work on the third video. And don't forget, there is a sample about standardized testing that's available to you, in addition to this little veganism one that I worked on here.